This month on the First Person Podcast, Betsy, Rob, and I are joined by our first ever special guest, Michael Lutz, to discuss some of the latest trends in horror games, including indie horror, glitch horror, interactive fiction, and VR. What is the role of jump scares in the modern horror game? What kind of fears does glitch horror play on? Is PT really a failed project, and how might Resident Evil 7 be following in its footsteps? We also talked to Michael about his work and how he manages to balance his academic and creative projects. For it.
We're going to make extra work for you, Alex. You get to edit the beeps.
Do we need to do a clap thing again?
Are we clapping?
Okay, he's shaking his head.
Alex says we don't need to clap. Let's just do it.
All right, we're going to start in 3, 2, 1. My name is Alexandra Orlando, and you can find me at Alex G. Orlando.
Hi, I'm Rob. You can reach me on Twitter at robotparking.
I'm Betsy. You can find me on Twitter at Betsy Bray.
And today we have a very special guest. The first time the FPS podcast has ever had a guest before, we have Michael Lutz.
Yay!
Hi, I'm Michael Lutz. Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Warren is Dead.
So today we're going to be talking about indie horror and a little bit of horror in general, and I think we have the perfect guest for that. So Michael, what have you been up to lately?
Well, for the most part, I have been writing my dissertation and not really making a lot of horror games, which is why you've asked me to be here. I certainly have been playing horror games and thinking about them, so I will have plenty of thoughts to share, I'm sure.
If people haven't heard of your games at all, and I can't imagine who would have not heard of your games.
That I am probably the most well-known for, both of them made in Twine. The first one is My Father's Long, Long Legs, which is a interactive story type thing that I made in 2013, I think, at this point. That got kind of big. It was very popular on Tumblr with teens, actually. Just the thing that I noticed, like kids on Tumblr really like this for whatever reason. It's a spooky story about a young woman sort of reflecting on her life and her father, who comes home from work one day and has a shovel and goes into the basement and just starts digging and does not stop for a very, very, very long time. The year after that, in 2014, I did The Uncle Who Works for Nintendo, which blew my mind in terms of the people who were like talking about it. It was, linked on Kotaku. It was huge than anything else I've ever done. And the premise there was basically, every kid, when you're a kid, you always have that friend who has like all of the inside scoops on what is happening in the gaming industry, and proverbially, at least when I was a kid, it was because he had the uncle who worked at Nintendo. And so the story there is that you are having a sleepover with your friend whose uncle works for Nintendo, and he's going to come visit. He's not particularly nice. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
I have to say that Uncle Who Works for Nintendo is one of my all-time favorite games. And if people have never played it, they should really give it a shot. It's a great experience.
Oh, thank you. It's really cool to hear people say that, like, my games are their favorite games. It's still very strange to hear people say that.
I'd like to throw in that I really appreciated the just little note at the beginning of Uncle that tells you that there is no jump scares. And I don't know how often I've seen that. I think that was the first time I've ever seen that in a game. And I really appreciated that because I am one of those people that is just terrible with jump scares, but I love horror. So you never know what you're going to get. And just like that little touch really made, I was just like, yeah, I don't know why I was so into that. I was just like, they're like amazing. Thank you so much for doing that.
Oh, I mean, no problem. I wanted to make that clear because I think a lot of horror on the internet does rely on jump scares, right? I think for whatever reason, being like sitting there at your computer, like intently watching a screen makes jump scares really easy to do. And I think that turns off a lot of people from like anything that is potentially like scary online. So I want to be very clear up front that like, I don't do that. I don't want to do that. I want to do something different. I don't want to do the jump scare. I want to do something more atmospheric, and I want to signal that to, any potential audience who might, be into the idea of, horror, but is not into the idea of the jump scare.
Yeah, and I think it's a very user and audience centered approach to designing horror in a way that focusing on the atmosphere and focusing on understanding your audiences when playing a horror game in this vulnerable sort of position, and the vulnerability is part of the experience and not taking advantage of that it's something that I think a lot of horror games could benefit from. But I mean, I also like plenty of games that have jump scares, but I did appreciate that Uncle didn't have that.
And I think too, when you're doing interactive fiction, it's almost, and I don't mean to slam jump scares because I think there's a time and place for them. But when you're dealing with kind of the fine crafting of text and creating a story, jump scares in many ways, I think, detract from what can be done equally or better with words. And I think you accomplish that really well with your games.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I agree, right? I definitely think that there is a time and a place for them. Like the way that I've described it before actually is that in the end, it's the difference between using a power drill and using a screwdriver. And I'm a screwdriver type of guy.
That's a really good way of putting it too. Like you can definitely hammer jump scares all over a game. And I mean, it has an effect, that's for sure. But they do wear down. Like jump scares get less and less scary for me the more of them in a row I experience. Mm-hmm. Playing Uncle, for example, and you noted at one point in the game, like you hoped that you made a game that became less scary in one way the more you played it and kind of deeper in another way as you played it. And that was a really cool effect, I thought. Like not depending on the jump scare made it scary in a different way as I kept playing.
I don't know. It's always really cool to hear people talk about their experiences because it's interesting how that plays out. I can see how that plays out as the person who made it, but I definitely did not sit down and think like, oh, I shall brilliantly design the game this way. You know what I mean?
One thing that I really appreciated about the Uncle works for Nintendo, and I don't know if you actually remember me tweeting at you this, but the first time you released it, and I sat down to play it, and you get to the part where the Uncle is finally showing up, and you use like Twine has like the ability to just actually put text and make it look like it's an error within Twine. And the first time that popped up, I was like, did this game break? Is there something wrong with this? And I remember tweeting at you, I was like, I'm getting error messages, and I was like, and then I clicked like a couple screens and I was like, oh, never mind, functioning as intended.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that was fun because I realized like, oh, Twine has this built-in thing to show you as the creator, like, oh, you wrote some code here that didn't work. And I was like, well, I'm just going to use that now. I'm going to write a bunch of broken code in order to make the game like look broken, but I'm going to purposefully break it. So that was a lot of fun, and I'm glad so many people like responded to that so positively.
Yeah, you were that guy who just like emailed the message developer like, your game doesn't work, fix it. I paid good money for this game. for this free game. Don't touch any chords.
Yeah, don't touch any chords. Touch no chords.
Okay.
I did a Twine game for Ludum Dare or something like that, and it wound up in a mix of stuff that Porpentine was covering, and she tweeted at me, she's like, hey, your game's broken in this one spot. You may want to, like... And I was like, oh, thank you. This is awesome, because that was amazing, but it was also just like, oh, I need to fix this right now. And just seeing, like, the chatter was already kind of coming up around it, so I was just like, knee-jerk response, and then was like, oh, no, this is actually really cool.
No, like I'm super into like glitch horror in general. Just like the idea of like the game is broken in a way that is scary or terrifying. And it's something that I'm seeing a little bit more of now. It's a really interesting trend in general, like the broken game or the game that's kind of out to get you.
So what do you guys think it is about the like broken game that strikes as a very useful vehicle for horror? I know my favorite is, I guess it's not really a game, but the whole like Ben Drowned thing kind of opened my mind to like what you can do with that sort of idea, and just like the story of this kid going to like, I believe it's a garage sale, and then just picking up this cartridge. And I think you really identify with that because we've all been that kid that wants like to get a good find at a garage sale to get a game cheaper because, you know, you can't afford them on your own when you're a kid. And then to just have that play experience be disrupted in such a crazy way.
Mm-hmm. A lot of game spaces are very, especially video game spaces, are very logically organized. Things are very causal in a way that, you know, real life is not. I can go into a situation or something like that, and I know at a certain point, like, how NPCs are going to function in this game. They're always going to stand there with their hand on their hips, like, kind of rotating their shoulders back and forth with an exclamation point over their head. They're never going to, like, walk away or go and kill someone that, you know, is in my party for no reason, unless there's, like, very specific cues that kind of explain themselves to me. So I think part of that aspect, or the part that I respond to the most, is the idea that these games are kind of, that like real life is kind of creeping into them. The technology is faltering in a way that kind of runs counter to what we come to games for, or what, you know, what games are designed to do, which is kind of help us get away from the horror of mortality and all that stuff, our fleshy bodies and the causal universes.
I think that's like on point, right? I think there's something about being aware of like the mediated nature of the gaming experience that makes that kind of glitch horror particularly, I guess, astringent, right? I know what I always think of is like as a kid and I would hit a glitch in a game or like the, you know, because this is the days of cartridges, right? Like the console would be acting up or something like that. And there was this kind of terror, right, of like, as a kid, right, a very young kid, like, this game is broken and I will never be able to beat it. The other thing is like, as a kid, right, like, this thing that my parents spent a lot of money on for me is now broken.
Yeah, and there's no way they're going to buy you another one.
Right. So now it's like, not only is this thing that my parents, or like, you know, that I spent money on broken, now it's also going to kill me, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely like a loss of control sensation. Like playing something like Calendula or I'm Scared is the kind of experience where it's like all of a sudden this thing that was your toy that you were in control of and you were playing with is now playing with you in a way that is like super uncomfortable. And I mean, like, to a degree, you get that with Pony Island, too, even though that's a lot more of, like, I don't know, that one's not necessarily as scary so much as just, like, messing with you.
Yeah. They rip the mask off really early in Pony Island.
Yeah.
It's like about 5 minutes in, and you're just like, oh, no, okay, I guess this is what we're working with here, which is still, like, I still appreciate that game for all of the weirdness that it tries to do.
No, but like the first time I got a fake blue screen and I'm Scared, I thought my computer had actually crashed, like seriously. And I was like, oh God, what happened? And then, you know, it's fine. And there's a taunting little message for you on your desktop. And the idea of like, this game is actually messing with my rather expensive computer. It goes back to, oh God, like this is a thing I bought and paid for. So I don't know, like that's kind of a weird thing to say, but part of the glitch horror is commercial, like money based.
And even like Undertale, again, not horror, but plays with that as well, where it's when you're making choices in a story context, having that taken away and not getting maybe the ending that you wanted or the path that you wanted and not being able to do anything about that inside the game is I wouldn't say it's like horrifying, but it makes you feel pretty bad.
And if you delve deep enough into the Undertale fandom, you'll also just find some legitimately horrifying experiences all on your own.
No offense to any fans of Undertale.
Well, like, I think Undertale was one of the first times I saw, like, this kind of glitch horror thing happen, and just this idea, like, this game is like, you put a lot of time and effort into this. Guess what? I took it away. Like, you can't have your save file back. And it's like, what do you mean I can't have my save file back? Like, I need that.
And especially for, I think, games researchers, too. That's like,
oh my God,
literal opportunity cost right there, where that's your research, that's your work on top of it all. So you're just like, oh God, I don't have time to replay this game again. Like, I've got to write the paper on this game.
R.I.P. job.
Yeah. I'm going to get fired. Thanks, Flowey.
Yeah.
Flowey's going to take our jobs.
Oh God.
We need to build a fire. No.
Oh God.
I can't. I don't
It happened.
To. No, I don't
We'll have to tag this podcast spoilers for Undertale. You may not have expected it, but yeah.
Oh, well.
That's okay. We talked a little bit about jump scares and glitch horror. Are there any other trends that we're noticing lately when it comes to horror games? What's in right now?
Five Nights at Freddy's knockoffs. Yeah, I don't. I guess you've either got like the Amnesia school, you got glitch horror, or there's possibly there's like the jump scare stuff, and I think a lot of those are orchestrated to kind of cater to like a streaming audience. Like at a certain point, there's a bit of a performative aspect to playing those games or watching people play those games. I have not done enough research into streaming stuff to really get into it, but I think a lot of the popularity for Five Nights at Freddy's stems from that. I'm playing this game and I'm terrified, and I'm kind of maybe overplaying that or hamming it up because I have a bunch of people watching. And
yeah, it's oddly enough, like it's a game that I most of the time when you play horror games, you would play them like on your own kind of a thing. But we do a lot of group playing of the Five Nights series just because it's fun to play it in a group and have everybody freak out kind of together. So there's almost like a horror movie element to it. And the first couple games so straightforward and focused, it's just a whole bunch of screeching all at once. And I mean, I've played quite a bit of it, and I'm a pretty decent fan of the series, but I wouldn't say it's a complicated series by any mean. The new one is doing something kind of different, though.
I don't think I've looked into any of them past like the fourth. How many of them are there now? Like
that was my
3 dozen?
Oh, there's Five Nights at Freddy's, Five Nights at Freddy's 2, Five Nights at Freddy's 3, Five Nights at Freddy's 4, Five Nights at Freddy's World, and Five Nights at Freddy's Sister Location. We don't talk about Five Nights at Freddy's World, though.
Is that the MMO?
The RPG, yeah.
Is it? That was a joke. I know nothing.
No, there is actually an RPG. It's dreadful.
I'm convinced that Scott Cawthon is going to announce Five Nights at Freddy's 10 at E3 from atop a burning cop car in 2017. Like it's just going to happen that somehow like the incremental like iteration on Five Nights at Freddy's is dovetailing into just this state of utter abject chaos, and at a certain point that will become the spearhead that, so let's keep mixing these metaphors, that bursts the balloon and deflates everything.
Yeah, no, I mean Five Nights at Freddy's is interesting. I mean, because in terms of mechanics, right, the game is basically nothing but a jump scare machine.
Exactly.
That is just really what it's there for. And I do think that, what's better than playing a game where there are jump scares? It's watching someone play a game with jump scares and react to it. And I think that actually touches on what we were talking about before. There are people who like horror who don't necessarily like jump scares, but back to jump scares, like that's fun, right?
Well, I mean, look at PewDiePie, right? Like he's like a billion bajillionaire because people like him enough to watch him react to jump scares.
He is a screech machine. And I mean, same thing with Markiplier, who, is the I'm not going to do the voice, the king of Five Nights at Freddy's. He has a particular yelling voice he does for that. It's a very odd thing to go and want to watch somebody freak out. And the more over the top it is, the more people seem to like it.
When I was in Korea, I was watching a gaming channel, and they had a whole reality TV show about people playing jump scare games in a room in the dark, and then they had people coming up behind them as they were playing the game to scare them.
Nope.
And that's on the television. Like,
Nope.
So clearly there's enough people out there interested in watching it that they need to put that on there.
Hard pass.
Yeah, it was kind of cringe a little bit, but it's a big thing.
The series is so self-aware of that kind of thing. Like in the Sister Location game that came out a couple weeks ago, there's a moment where, and there's actually like voice acting instead of just screeching in the most recent game. There's a moment where a character says like something, to paraphrase, what would make a person want to spend their time in a place like this? And then there's just this pause, and I'm like, well, I feel uncomfortable. Like, don't judge me, Circus Baby.
There's the title.
Yeah, don't judge me, Circus Baby.
But the jump scare mechanic is something that, like in the Five Nights series in particular, is so, you have to listen so hard to be afraid of it. Like you turn the sound off in a Five Nights game, and it's like not even the same thing. And like with how that game evolves, like listening becomes more and more of a part of it, to the point where like you can't actually watch one of those screechy YouTubers play them very reliably because they have to shut up and talk. Like they can't talk while they're playing because they have to listen to, if they actually want to beat the game, which is people want to see them freak out and people want to see them win.
About a year ago, I guess, former editor-in-chief Emma and a few other people played through PT, streaming it on the FPS Twitch account, and I was at work listening to it, and because they were just playing it kind of like volume turned a bit down, people wandering in and out in a well-lit room, they were just like, game is kind of goofy, and I'm sitting there like hearing all of the noises like come in through my headphones, and I'm just like, no, this is actually deeply uncomfortable. I can't keep watching this. Yeah, it was, I think, yeah, sound is a huge component, especially to like those types of jump scare games. And I think PT is guilty of that a little bit too. And yeah, just the amount of engineering that or thought that needs to go into those things to make you feel creepy it's kind of impressive. Even as little as it's being done in Five Nights at Freddy's, I think Coffin has hit into something important there.
Yeah.
The coffin.
The coffin
has hit into something important.
Coffin.
Is that what you said? Oh, I thought you've been saying coffin the whole time.
Yeah, Scott Coffin.
Like,
Scott Coffin.
I was like, I assume that's his game developer name.
Yeah,
The
no.
Molgoth dystopia we all deserve.
Oh boy. I mean, I'm wearing a Napalm Death shirt, so like,
Yes,
yeah.
you are.
I highly recommend Spooky's House of Scares if you have not played that one. I believe it's free on Steam, and it plays on that trope where there's like hundreds of floors, and each floor there's like, at first the jump scares are like little ghosts that come out of, like in a haunted house where like they're attached to a wood plank and they jump out, and then it's and like they're little ghosts. And then like slowly it gets more messed up as you go down the floors. I highly recommend it. Very good Halloween game.
That sounds like my jam.
Sounds very cool.
Yeah. So it's, at first I thought this is the jump scare game for me because I'm a big baby. But then I'm like, oh no.
No, you guys are serious about these jump scares. I
Yeah,
guess.
they're getting real.
Yeah.
So we brought up TP,
Oh, toilet paper.
which is the thing that people use to decorate trees during Halloween.
Exactly.
It make them look like a ghost.
Right. Exactly. But on the similar note, reverse that. And you get PT, which, as we know, is kind of the... Okay, pause for laughter.
Segway Hall of Fame. 10 out of 10.
Far and away the best segue we've ever had on this podcast.
Don't delete any of that. So PT, which is, for those of you who don't know, the kind of failed Silent Hill reboot done by Hideo Kojima, although failed, is really considered, I would say, an enormous success with the fans. And people are very disappointed that the demo is gone and are holding it onto it for dear life on their PS4s. But it seems like Resident Evil 7 is kind of took the reins as far as like the style of this project goes. I found that playing the Resident Evil 7 demo, I saw a lot of similarities to PT. And do we think that the VR support for this game has anything to do with the success or the backing for this game to even exist in the first place? Because it's kind of a major title that's associated with the push for VR right now, because right now we're seeing a lot of short form experiences with VR. Mm-hmm. We're not getting a full game, and it seems like Resident Evil 7 is going to be one of the first.
Well, I know I'm hearing a lot of calls in the VR community for like a game to actually launch VR, because people keep saying like, oh, these are cute little neat experiences, but it's not worth shelling out $800 when there aren't any games. And when people started first, when chatter about VR first started, people were like, oh, I want to play a horror game in that. So like when you think about combining like what's commercially successful, what's, a franchise is a good way to go for something to encourage buy-in, because people are already so invested in it. And Resident Evil is like a classic.
Well, and Resident Evil 6 did not do super great.
Yeah.
And it tried to capitalize hard on its action. It's sort of like action gameplay that kind of de-emphasized a lot of the horror aspects of it. Yeah, I have a million zillion thoughts about VR, but I think you don't realize how much you rely on being able to look away from the screen until you suddenly can't, and it's attached to your face. A friend of mine got an Oculus Dev Kit 2 or whatever it was, and he'd rigged up Alien Isolation to work with it, and except that he didn't have a gamepad. So I was groping around at his keyboard and mouse, trying to move around, and I got caught up on the geometry. Like I actually opened a door, turned a corner, and the alien was just there. And I turned around and got caught on the geometry, and then just like looked down, and the tail of the alien had come out through my chest. And at that point, I nearly wrenched the thing off my head and threw it on the floor, and was like, "No thanks." But that said, like, I don't know if that's going to launch VR, because you're going to play that once and be like, this is deeply unpleasant. Why did I spend $800 to play this?
Not to mention all of the wrenched off the head headsets are going to be, maybe that's why they're launching it for horror games. You'll have to buy more headsets.
It's like the Wiimotes in the TV.
Someone's going to set up a Tumblr of VR headsets thrown through TVs. But yeah, I do think that the money that's going out there, like, there's a bit easier to get funding for a project that is going to use VR. I feel like Capcom's also in a spot. They need to have a big hit, and I don't think the Monster Hunters are cutting it for them.
And they need to get back to basics.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of their franchises are kind of going a little bit off the rails right now.
The Monster Hunter stuff is still really good. It's just there's
Evil 6.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on VR, Michael, and Resident Evil 7? Have you had a chance to play the demo?
I have not played the demo. I have no VR technology. I have very little very little firsthand experience, and all I have is basically intuition. So I can see why people would really be interested in a horror game in VR, but I also think about what Rob was just talking about, right? The overwhelming nature of that sort of gameplay. I actually think of Edgar Allan Poe, right? Who basically in one of his essays says that, like, horror fiction only makes sense as a short story. Because if you wrote a full horror novel, like, it would, like, either be totally crap, it would completely fall apart, or, you would just overwhelm your reader with, like, pessimism. It would be totally unpleasant. And that's very interesting, right? When I think about PT, which I have played, right, and how that was structurally, just so repetitive. So much like just a game where you walk through this same hallway as many times as possible, kind of this bite-sized chunk of, something, right? We still, because of how things sort of came out there politically and corporately, we have no idea what that was supposed to indicate for whatever Silent Hills was going to be. There's not even any reason to think that Silent Hills might have been a full PT-like experience, but I know a lot of people definitely felt like it could have been or should have been. In fact, like when, PTA fell through, one of the is that we need to be careful here because, like, with this game sort of lost forever, we are in a prime spot to kind of write it a hagiography and make it into a sort of, like, patron saint for a type of game that never existed, or except in our imaginations. I am not terribly familiar with the Resident Evil 7 demo. I don't really know much about it. I haven't seen any videos, but I have read some stuff that I know where Capcom came out and had to say that, like, none of the PT people, like, none of those team members, like, worked on this. Is that making that up?
I haven't heard anything specifically about that, but I wouldn't be surprised because it's very similar in that it's first person, very confined, spaces, and you're not necessarily walking around in circles, but I think there's this element of very, like, basic mystery. Like, it's not a lot of puzzles you have to solve, but, like, there's a few things in the house that you do have to find. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all. And I think it's, again, like the fans kind of clamoring and hoping for some elements of PT to come through in a final version. I do think it's interesting that you talk about you're essentially alluding to PT as a short story of games, which I think is really fascinating because we don't think of game demos as have any sort of value. They're kind of downloaded and played maybe for an hour or two and then deleted. And we kind of see how maybe movie trailers, to give it like a sort of another industry's example, are kind of celebrated as their own art form, although not always recognized. There is that kind of whole industry of making trailers and kind of the art of selling a game. But here, it's kind of, I see the similarities.
I will say that there's a Final Fantasy 15 trailer it's the Reclaim Your Throne one. Just set that to any kind of music, and it's pretty good. It's a good time.
For our listeners, if you're interested in any of Rob's crossfade remixes of anything over Final Fantasy, again, check out his Twitter.
Oh boy.
Uh-oh, don't at me, though.
That whole thread is amazing.
So yeah, going back to that, I think that there are opportunities, I think, for more horror games like PT to come out. Not necessarily at a big budget studio, because I don't think that's required to make a game like PT. You know, we have some great minds that kind of put that together, but it paves the way for, I think, other people to model their games after, or at least get inspiration from PT.
I'm thinking about it more, and like, you know, from the bigger developers, you tend to see bigger, longer games. And if we're going to make the comparison about short stories, maybe there's been a lot of indie success because those tend to be shorter, more focused experiences that don't drag on into the sort of unpleasant, long-standing anxiety, dread sort of a situation. I mean, with longer horror games, they do have to be spaced out with action sequences or puzzle solving. You know, there has to be some rise and fall of the arrival to a horrifying thing. But with the short ones or PT, you can just get to the scare and get to it again and get to it again.
Rinse, repeat.
And I also think one of the other things, right, and this is sort of latent in the fact that like PT was a weird actually I think they called it a trailer or something like that. I think that was actually the word that they did use, or something to that effect.
Yeah, I think PT stands for playable trailer, right?
Hills, whatever that was going to be. And then we have the Resident Evil 7 demo with the larger developers. The horror, I think, is prone to be more successful if it's going to like latch into some sort of franchise or a kind of like brand recognition. I can't think of many just like one-off horror games, or rather, like, I'm sure they exist, right? But for whatever reason, they don't tend to stick around in quite the same way. Or horror game is made, then there is a kind of demand for equal. Whereas with indie developers, you can get something. Well, I mean, with indie developers, you can have Five Nights at Freddy's. Yeah. Ta-da! But also, you can have someone like Kitty Horror Show, who is a wonderful artist who works primarily in kind of atmospheric horror experiences that she makes in Unity. And her stuff is, you know, short, atmospheric horror stuff in the way that we would expect from an indie developer. But for her, she doesn't have to make it part of like a continuity or a franchise, right? It's more about aesthetic and her interests being expressed, re-expressed, refined, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up Kitty Horror Show, because that kind of counterpoint to the Five Nights at Freddy's in terms of not only atmospheric, but like the vibe I get from a lot of the work is both superstitious and kind of ritualistic in a lot of ways that I really personally respond to. I think a lot about, you know, Oh No Problems or Eva Problems, Sabat, for like in a game that is not explicitly horrific, but it is very much based around and Augury is a similar one where there's again it's more atmospheric and short playing, but taps into kind of this weird superstitious type of mood almost.
That's very much so how I felt playing like Calendula. And I know that's tying back into the glitch horror thing, but it was like the scary parts of Calendula were the short sort of atmospheric moments where you think you're playing the game, but the game is trying to play the game. It's kind of one of those.
Calendula strikes me as one where maybe they actually put the messaging in the game where they're like, this is not really a game. It's like a art piece or something. They seem a bit skittish about calling it a game. And I can't tell if that's like a rhetorical position because they know what the audience is for people that have expectations of games, or they just really wanted to make a very strange. I don't even know how to describe it. Digital experience.
Yeah, I would call it a game, but I also don't have to live with people telling me it's not a game. So
I should go back and replay that. I really I got through it very quickly, but I really thoroughly enjoyed it.
Is that ever a challenge for you, Michael, with your work? The labeling of such, because the lines kind of blur, I think, for interactive fiction a lot too, where it is a game, but it's not always labeled as such depending on who you're talking to, I think. Yeah,
I mean, I have a very sort of complicated relationship with this question because I am a literary scholar. The odd thing about me, right, is that I sort of think about it and I'm like, well, really all fiction is interactive, right? Because when I'm sitting there reading a Henry James novel, I'm not just like absorbing whatever content typing into my head. I'm doing like all of this other stuff, right? Like all of these stratagems where I'm either trying to like read against the author or I'm connecting it to all these discourses, right? So in some ways I have a vested interest in keeping lines between interactive fiction and other types of sort of media blurry. And at the same time, I tend to, call things games when I feel like I am being sort of more freeform with them. I would call other things interactive fiction if it's more like a narrative that has some fairly defined like paths. that all bring you to the same ending, or that reads maybe more like a choose your own adventure book without a lot of variation between those decisions. But again, that's just kind of a personal decision. I don't think it's anything prescriptive. I'm never going to be consistent on it, I think. I'm always going to sort of be hopping around from game to interactive fiction. I am lucky enough that I've never really had anyone come at me about my games not being really games. In fact, the only time that something like close to that has happened was when I was giving a like digital humanities workshop to some tenured faculty a couple of years ago, and I had this grizzled old philosophy professor look at Twine and just be like, "That's not a game." And it's like, you're like, 60 years old, you're the one who's telling me that this isn't a game.
Even I found on the flip side of that, as someone who's made stuff, like I've submitted Twine games to game jams and actually had the reactions have largely been either just kind of befuddlement, because I tend to write, it's all first draft stuff and I just kind of throw it together over the course of a weekend, like I'm going to figure out how to do this real weird experiment and then see what game developers think of it. And a lot of them are just like, okay, I guess I get where you were going for with this. I don't know how to give you any feedback on this because it seems like you really wanted to just do this thing. The only time I've actually had that weird push was from like giving game design talks. So you have all these people like giving talks about Unity, and I'm sitting here talking about Twine, and I've had engineers sit in the room with me and be like, "So where do I put the code in?" And then I'm just like, "You put the JavaScript in here," and then they just kind of go, "But where do I put the real code in?" And I'm like, "I don't know. go to the Unity talk." I'm surprised he didn't have like didn't you do Tower of the Bloodlord?
I did do Tower of the Bloodlord, yes.
I'm surprised you didn't get anyone come at you for the Tower of the Bloodlord is based on you playing a half an hour of Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 or something like that, and then there are like links that you can click, and it's just like press Y, and that's you jump in the air or you throw the grenade, and it's a very
that was my first game, and I completely recreated everything you can do in Call of Duty within the Twine engine. So yeah.
It's the best adaptation of Call of Duty I've ever seen. But yeah, I'm surprised no one came out to you like you've done a disservice to the Call of Duty.
Yeah, I don't know. It's very strange. The call of like the response to Tower of the Bloodlord, right, was not as big as like later games. But I remember like speaking of Porpentine reaching out to people. She covered it on her column at Free Indie Games when that was still updating. And that was like, oh my gosh. So from that point, other people were playing it, and I was like sort of keeping track of it in like Reddit comments and things like that. And the thing that really surprised me was that a lot of people thought that the game was much, much bigger than it actually was, right? Rather than being like, oh, this is a disservice to the Call of Duty franchise, they were like, there's got to be a way to learn to throw the grenade. Even though in the game, every time you try to throw a grenade, you end up destroying yourself because you never actually finish the tutorial and learn how to throw a grenade. So when you hit the grenade throwing button, you just die automatically.
Jeez. So first person, a little bit of context, that First Person Scholar is attached to a research institute called the Games Institute. And back before we actually had like a space and desks and stuff for everyone, we were just meeting in the basement of a bar somewhere. When Tower of the Bloodlord came out, like we were trying to have like weekly discussions about games. It's like, oh, what have you played this week or whatever? And when that came out, that was actually like one of the assigned games, and it was just a matter of like, what about this Twine thing? And then it left a lot of us sitting like rubbing our chins going like, what about this Twine thing? And it wasn't until like long after I think My Father's Long Long Legs came out that I was like, oh, this is the same person. Okay, everything makes a lot more sense now. So,
I'm glad you could find continuity there.
Yeah.
So we have only a few minutes left, but I thought I'd ask maybe a larger question related to your work, Michael. It's basically how do you manage your creative projects with kind of the academic life? I know many of us here are, mostly English students, and we're often told, well, make a thing. And we're like, we don't know how to make the thing. And Twine seems to be a good avenue for that. But it's really hard to be creative and also be writing a dissertation at the same time. So I was wondering your thoughts on a little bit of that.
So obviously I haven't released really anything big since really The Uncle Who Works for Nintendo. I think that was really my last big release. And that was the last semester before I started writing my prospectus and my dissertation and everything. That's basically what I've been on. But so that's a short way of saying, like, I don't know how to balance creative and academic work. I'm not doing it, but that's also kind of a lie. Twine is a really useful tool for making games and things like that. And if I had ideas that I felt were suited to shorter experiences, I would probably be turning out like more shorter things in line with kind of more interactive fiction-y sort of digital poetry things. I've been kind of thinking about moving in that direction. But I have been working other projects in my spare time. I just, for the most part, am devoting a lot of my mental energy to the dissertation itself. Where my creative side does end up manifesting itself, usually, I guess, is like Twitter, right? Just making 1,000 really bad jokes a day. But more lately, I've been thinking like, okay, I could probably do something a little more productive with this. And so I started a Patreon to basically make a little bit of money so I could get ends to meet, but also to kind of have pressure to produce more regularly, like to produce more regularly extended sort of creative pieces. So I've been getting back more into traditional fiction, which is something that I wrote for a long, long time and then kind of dropped when I started doing things in Twine. But, having the Patreon allow me to carve out like, a weekend every month and just be like, I am writing my Patreon piece this weekend. And because it is my Patreon, because people are paying me for this, I don't have to feel guilty about the fact that I am not making another journey to the library to pull out 6 more books to look at, because that's kind of how my mind works, is I always feel like I have to have justification for the things that I love. Even if I'm doing them because I enjoy them, right? I have to be like, why are you not doing this other thing that's much more pressing and much more important?
Yeah, and I think we can relate to the grad student guilt. Even if it's like, I have to play this game for my dissertation, it's still playing a game, and sometimes it's still not work. So it's definitely very, very difficult to find that balance. So it's really good advice to kind of do your thing and market your skills, and people will support that. And we will we'll plug your Patreon in the notes for this episode as well. Michael, thanks so much for joining us. Is there anything else that you wanted to plug?
No, I don't think so. I think I am basically good. If you're going to link to my Patreon, that's great. I also have a regular website that I post the things that I write on Patreon, or I write for the Patreon on, and that is correlatedcontents.com. And I think that's all I can really think of to throw out there for you.
Well, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to have you.
No, thank you for having me. It was great.
Thank you for listening to the First Person Podcast. I would like to thank Neil Randall and the staff at the Games Institute for their support, as well as Alex Fleck, our podcast producer. We'd also like to thank Stephen Trothan, who wrote and composed our theme music.